Welcome to Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. North America's largest land bird is slipping steadily toward extinction. This great bird, the California condor, has now been reduced to perhaps fewer than 30 in number, possibly because of increased land development, decreased food supply, lingering pesticides, and pollution of the environment. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has initiated a condor recovery program which would include radio telemetry and the capture of some of the remaining California condors to breed them in captivity. A pilot program to perfect techniques and procedures for capturing the California condors is being conducted with a close relative, the Andean condor, a species which is more abundant. This program, that is so important to the future of the California condor, involves 2 continents and will take us finally to the coast of Peru, where in the valleys of sand next to the desert mountains, scientists will be carrying out their research. The project was started by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Patuxent Wildlife Research Center under the direction of Project Officer Dr. James W. Carpenter.
Here, captive condors are being bred and are rearing young for introduction into the wild. We've been able to get these captive birds to lay 2 eggs each year, rather than 1 egg every other year, as is characteristic of the wild condors. The young from these extra eggs can then be hand-raised, thereby greatly increasing the number of young condors available for release into the wild.
Condor eggs from the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland and the Metro Zoo of Greater Miami are taken to the Bronx Zoo in New York for experiments in hand-raising of chicks from captive birds. These large birds, with a wingspread of 10 feet, have proved to be easily bred in captivity. Here, in cooperation with the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, Dr. Don Bruning is conducting research with captive breeding Andean condors, which may help to save its endangered California relative.
Here at the Bronx Zoo, we have developed techniques for raising Andean condor chicks by hand. One method is to remove the eggs from the nest of captive breeding birds immediately after laying and placing the egg in an incubator.
Don Bruning and his staff at the zoo are studying the behavior of condors of all ages. It is in an incubator in the ornithological lab that the hatching of condor eggs takes place. The eggs are about 6 inches long and weigh about half a pound. Incubation is about 60 days, at which time the chick begins to chip its way out of the egg. In 2 or 3 days, the chick is out of its shell. It is then moved to a small brooder where hand-rearing begins. A lab assistant feeds the chick a diet of pre-digested meats as soon as it is strong enough to raise its head. At this age, its eyesight is poor, and it can't see objects more than a few inches away. As its eyesight improves, the chick will have to be visually isolated from the human beings that feed it to prevent the chick from regarding people as parents. Hand puppets that simulate the heads of adult male and female condors are used to provide the chick with an appropriate parent image. As soon as the chick is uncovered and can see better, the puppet is presented to it. The lab assistant will then use the puppet to distract the chick's attention from her as food is placed into the brooder. The chick will feed from a dish with the puppet head nearby. It associates the image of an adult condor with feedings and will not regard people as the source of food. At 2.5 months of age, the condor chick now weighs 12 pounds, and the puppet is still used at feedings. At this age, the chick flaps its wings and begs vigorously for food when it sees the puppet. A black cloth is used by researchers whenever they enter a rearing pen to handle an older chick. The cloth prevents the chick from seeing human beings, and it remains relatively calm while it is being handled. The young condor chicks are being removed from the rearing pen and carried to nearby shipping cages for a trip that will take them a continent away to their future home.
Tomorrow, these young condors will get their first glimpse of their new home on the Sechura Peninsula on the northern coast of Peru, where they will be released into the wild. Right now, their next stop is the airport.
The birds make the 24-hour flight without problems and complete the final leg of the trip to the remote release site on the Sechura Peninsula by four-wheel drive pickup truck. With the delivery of the birds to this harsh desert area, Dr. Bruning's job is finished. Now it will be the responsibility of University of Wisconsin doctoral candidate Mike Wallace to supervise the release of the captive-bred birds to join wild condors.
They'll be reared in this canyon and eventually released into the wild. With minimal human contact, they will be taught to forage and feed on natural meat sources. It is our aim to determine the best possible method of integrating these birds into the local wild population.
In the northern part of Peru, the coastal mountains form valleys which are perfect locations for release pens where newly arrived birds are kept until they're old enough to fly. Under contract to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Mike and his research assistants are preparing the birds for their later release. Part of the research with these young birds involves the placing of the solar-powered transmitters on the wing instead of on the body. Momentarily calm, the bird allows the procedure to progress quickly. Also being tested are the weight, size, and aerodynamics of the identification tags, which were especially designed for condors. The vinyl tags are quickly attached with a plastic rivet. The numbers allow identification from great distances. Soon, the young puppet-reared birds will be mature enough to fly, which is called fledging. Meanwhile, these new 3-month-old birds from the Bronx Zoo must stay in this release pen.
When they are released, they will be fed at first very close to this pen. The natural food for the birds in the area is goats and burros that die in the hills. For the released birds, it is necessary to create a natural-like food situation, which we call a feeding station. Here, a road-killed burro is used to attract the condors.
The older birds that we released earlier are in an interesting phase of their education. In areas like this, two things occur. First, our young birds learn to forage by finding a carcass that we move to a different location every few days. In addition, they are forced to socialize with wild condors that also feed here. Gradually, they follow the wild vultures and condors and forage naturally.
Observing a feeding station is the best way to gather behavioral data. Red-headed turkey vultures are always first to arrive at the carcass. The condors usually come in much later. The dull two-tone brown plumage is retained by both sexes of young condors until they mature. These 2-year-old condors were shipped from the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center several months ago and were released. They were raised by their parents in large flight pens at Patuxent, in contrast to the puppet-reared condors from the Bronx Zoo. The way these older condors adjust and interact with wild condors around the carcass will be compared with the young Bronx Zoo birds to be released later. The interaction of all birds at the carcass is important in determining how well the released condors are adjusting to the wild. The black vultures are fighting, as usual. Intervention in a fight between birds of a different species, as this young condor does, is quite rare. The wild adult condors with the black and white plumage are joining our released birds. Normal behavior at the carcass is typified by the adults getting primary access to food. Condors can go several days without feeding. When food is available, they can consume as much as 4.5 pounds at a time. One indication that our released birds are successfully integrating with the local wild condors is their confidence at the carcass. In the last 3 months, the parent-reared birds from Patuxent have been adjusting socially to the wild condors and now can hold their own during aggressive interactions. In general, the interactions of these Patuxent birds at this time resembles those of wild condors of the same age.
Observing the interactions of birds around the carcass is only one phase of the project. Another phase is the visual and electronic tracking of the birds, which is best done from a high elevation. From this high cliff, Carla Christensen has tracked many birds. She has visually located a bird in the distance. To see if it is one of the Patuxent birds, Mike and Carla will identify it with radio telemetry equipment that has a range of at least 100 miles. The signal from the radio transmitter on the bird's wing is picked up by the receiver. Carla has noted the frequency which identifies the bird. The increased intensity of the signal indicates that the bird is getting closer. It is now possible to visually read the tag on the bird. Number 11 has been off foraging in some distant canyons and is now coming back to an area which is familiar to her. She will roost tonight with both wild and other released birds on the ledges of the nearby cliffs where they feel safe. At this time, the Patuxent birds fly as well as the wild condors. Even a fluttering tag, which has now been redesigned, does not affect the flight of this magnificent bird. In an effort to select the safest methods for capturing California condors, the most practical techniques are being tested and evaluated on Andean condors. Today, Mike and his Peruvian assistant, William Torres, are preparing to capture wild birds with a rocket-propelled net. They have built a blind of branches from which they can observe the trapping area.
Sometimes we wait days before the turkey vultures arrive, but today they land almost immediately on the bait in front of the net. The rocket net is well concealed in a shallow trench, and the 3 rockets that propel it are hidden by branches. The black vultures have joined the turkey vultures and compete for food, fighting for feeding positions before the condors arrive. When first approaching the carcass, the large condors often cause the smaller birds to become nervous. A feeding area is a good place to observe the interactions between tagged Patuxent birds and wild birds, since they are competing for food. Here, typically, the juvenile Patuxent bird is holding its own in interactions with a wild juvenile. Eventually, most of the vultures will be displaced by the condors at the feeding area. Fighting is one of the ways the vultures may express their frustration at being moved off the food they discovered first. After waiting in the blind for hours, finally, a wild adult condor arrives. The spreading of the wings is one of the sexual or aggressive displays that may occur at a feeding area. It may take a while for more wild condors to approach the carcass, and one or two more are needed before the rockets will be fired. Many times, those already present at the feeding area leave the carcass for no apparent reason. More wild condors have come to the bait, and now we'll have to be ready with the battery, which serves as a firing device. We want the birds around the carcass to have their heads down before the net is fired.
Quickness is important now. The wild birds must be secured, and any Patuxent birds that have been caught must be released. The rocket net has proved to be the most efficient and safe of the trapping techniques field tested for condors. Although one of the main purposes of live capturing these condors is to test techniques suitable for use with California condors, Mike has also found that netting the Patuxent birds makes them more wary around a carcass, which is behavior similar to that of wild condors. When tagged and released, this wild bird will provide data against which the Patuxent birds can be compared. Eventually, the data will also be used with the California condors.
The blue tag identifies this bird as being a wild, immature condor. Fortunately, wild condors behave calmly under the net, which makes processing both quick and easy. As with the other birds we're tracking, this wild bird will be fitted with a transmitter which weighs only 2 ounces and is powered by 2 solar panels. We will be able to monitor the activities of this young male for many years, since the radio transmitter has a long life expectancy. Radio tracking provides a wealth of information on condor nesting sites, reproduction, seasonal movement, daily foraging patterns, mortality factors, and social behavior. We will learn much about this bird as it goes about its daily routine.
Mike spends much of his time in the desert and along the coast tracking birds. A dune buggy is the best way to travel in the desert. Without the dune buggy, tracking of condors in the remote areas of the study site would be nearly impossible. A good place to stop and begin tracking birds is a high dune overlooking the coastline. Mike visits the coast regularly to locate and observe birds in the study. The radio telemetry receiver Mike uses in the dune buggy has a directional antenna which turns to sweep the area searching for radio signals. A bird is located almost immediately, and Mike identifies the signal as Condor number 13 from Patuxent. Finding this released bird out here on the coast alone is significant, because as condors range farther from their desert release site, they are becoming more independent, which is the single most important goal of this project. Before any attempt is made to capture California condors, much research is still required. In the next several years, Mike Wallace and his assistants in Peru will continue to monitor the released birds as they mature. And in Patuxent, Maryland, Dr. James W. Carpenter and his associates at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will supervise the refinements of the field techniques being tested. The results will contribute to the growing knowledge about capture and rearing techniques that might help save the California condor from extinction and ensure that this magnificent bird will always remain a part of the wild kingdom.